A black man in a sharp suit adjusted his tie. He stepped toward his car, unaware that his ordinary evening was about to turn into a nightmare. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed, tires screeched, and a cop leapt out with his gun already drawn. The man froze, heart pounding, as bystanders gasped in horror. This wasn't about crime. It wasn't about danger. It was about the color of his skin. But what the officer didn't realize was chilling. This man held more authority than anyone else on that street. And when the truth came out, the cop's career and his life as he knew it would shatter in an instant. He had worked his entire life to earn respect in a world that too often denied it to men who looked like him. Every degree, every late night in the office, every carefully pressed suit, he wore them like armor. To the outside world, he was a man of success and discipline, someone who carried himself with quiet authority. Yet, behind that success lay scars. Moments of being followed in stores, overlooked in meetings, and questioned for belonging in places he had rightfully earned. On this particular day, he left a meeting at his firm feeling proud. A major contract had just been finalized, one that would secure jobs for dozens of employees. He stepped out into the warm evening air, briefcase in hand, eager to get home to his family. The parking lot was nearly empty, the kind of quiet space where most people feel safe. But for him, safety was never guaranteed. A police cruiser idled across the street, its lights off, but its presence unmistakable. The officer inside had been watching him, suspicion etched into his gaze. To the cop, the tailored suit wasn't a sign of hard work or accomplishment. Instead, he saw a man who didn't belong, a man whose very existence in that space was cause for alarm. As the man unlocked his car, the officer's door swung open. Tires crunched against the pavement as the cruiser rolled forward. The man didn't notice at first, but the air was already heavy, thick with tension. In just a few moments, what began as a victorious day would spiral into a nightmare, one that would reveal just how fragile respect can be in a world still poisoned by prejudice. The sound of the police cruiser stopping behind him made the man's chest tighten. At first, he assumed it was a coincidence, an officer pulling into the lot for some routine matter. But the slam of a car door shattered that illusion. Heavy footsteps approached, quick and deliberate. Then came the sharp command, "Stop right there!" The man froze, his hand still on the car door handle. He turned slowly, meeting the officer's glare. The cop's eyes didn't soften at the sight of the briefcase or the tailored suit. Instead, they narrowed with suspicion, as if he had just caught a dangerous criminal in the act. One hand hovered near his holstered weapon, the other outstretched in authority. Around them, a few passers-by began to notice the unfolding scene. A woman pulling groceries stopped mid-step, her eyes wide with disbelief. A man across the street reached for his phone, recording quietly from the shadows. The tension was thick, vibrating through the air like static before a storm. The officer barked questions, each one more accusatory than the last. Why was he here? What was in the briefcase? Whose car was this? Every word carried the weight of presumption, the kind that stripped a man of dignity and replaced it with guilt he had never earned. The man raised his hands slowly, not an admission of wrongdoing, but in a silent plea for safety. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Memories of stories, of others who had faced this very terror and never made it home, rushed to the forefront of his mind. The officer's hand gripped his weapon. In that instant, the line between life and death grew paper thin. The man's success, his achievements, his identity None of it mattered. To the officer, he was reduced to nothing more than a threat. And then, with a chilling inevitability, the gun cleared its holster. The crowd gasped. The barrel pointed directly at his chest. The world seemed to hold its breath. The officer had no idea that this was a mistake that would cost him everything. The gun trembled in the officer's grip, but his face betrayed no hesitation. He had already made his decision. This man, standing in silence in a business suit, was somehow dangerous. The bystanders shouted, some begging him to stop, others frozen in disbelief. Phones were raised higher, every angle capturing the terrifying moment. The man in the suit didn't move. He knew the wrong gesture could end his life. He stood tall, hands raised, breathing shallow, his heart a drumbeat of fear and defiance. And just when it seemed the officer might pull the trigger, another voice cut through the chaos. It was sharp, commanding, unmistakable. "Holster your weapon, now." The officer stiffened, eyes darting sideways. From across the lot, a tall figure strode forward with authority that silenced the crowd. It was the police chief himself, his expression thunderous with rage. He had arrived on scene after reports of a disturbance, only to discover his own officer pointing a weapon at a man who was not only innocent, but one of the most respected leaders in the city. The chief's fury was palpable. Without hesitation, he grabbed the officer's arm, forcing the gun downward and ripped it from his hands. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the officer, suddenly powerless, stammered in confusion. He tried to justify his actions, pointing to the man's skin, his presence in the lot, anything to mask his prejudice. But every word fell flat in the heavy silence. The chief turned his back on the officer and faced the man in the suit with respect, not suspicion. He knew exactly who stood before him. A man who had built businesses, created jobs, and commanded dignity far beyond what the officer had ever recognized. In that moment, the contrast between the two men, the arrogance of ignorance and the strength of accomplishment, was undeniable. And then, with the eyes of the crowd, the cameras, and the trembling officer upon him, the chief made his decision. Right there, in public, without hesitation, he stripped the officer of his badge and declared his career finished. The officer's face went pale. His authority, his weapon, his arrogance, gone in an instant. What began as a life-threatening encounter had turned into something else entirely. A reckoning. The officer stood stunned, stripped of his badge, his weapon gone, his authority dissolved in front of a crowd that would never forget his actions. The cameras were still rolling, documenting every second. His name, his shame, would spread far beyond that parking lot. What he thought was power had turned into humiliation, and no excuse could save him now. The man in the suit, still shaken, lowered his hands slowly. The silence of the crowd gave way to murmurs of support. People who moments before had been bystanders were now witnesses to both injustice and accountability. Though his heart still pounded, he stood taller, not because the fear had passed, but because he refused to let prejudice break him. The chief placed a firm hand on his shoulder, offering both respect and apology. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start. For the man, this was more than a personal vindication. It was a reminder that racism, no matter how blatant, could never erase his worth. Yet, the deeper truth remained. This wasn't just one officer's failure. It was a reflection of a system that too often acted first on skin color and asked questions later. A system where a man's accomplishments, his dignity, even his very life, could be dismissed in a heartbeat because of prejudice. As the officer was led away, the crowd's eyes stayed fixed on the man in the suit. He was no longer just an individual. Wronged. He was a symbol of resilience, of how truth and authority, when united, could stand against injustice. And as he finally drove away, one question lingered for everyone who had witnessed it, and for all who would watch the videos spreading online. How many more lives must be placed in danger before society truly confronts the poison of racism? Because, until that answer changes, no man or woman of color can ever feel fully safe.